According to the Wall Street Journal, it sounds like Ukraine's senior command staff might be having a tough time without the benefit of U.S. mentorship. Or is it just old Soviet culture that refuses to die? But is it going to spell disaster for Ukraine? Let's talk about it. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Okay, so this is a story from the Wall Street Journal called Ukraine's once nimble army is mired in Soviet decision-making. And what's interesting is they talk about the fact that early in the war, this is, by the way, just kind of a summary of it. Early in the war, Ukraine basically by necessity relied on what they called a NATO style of fighting. And this refers to the fact that while commands tend to be centralized in terms of setting objectives, the actual execution of those objectives is left to subordinate commanders. And this meant that for a lot of Ukrainians, it meant preserving their manpower, right? But over the last 12 to 18 months, that the Ukrainian command has re-centralized and become much more Soviet in nature. In fact, the article says many Ukrainian soldiers grimly joke that it's the big Soviet army beating the little Soviet army. And this has been even more explicit in some of the public posts. For example, one battalion commander in Ukraine's 47th Mech Brigade railed against stupid orders and losses. He talked about the fear of many army generals who are only capable of issuing reprimands, investigations, and penalties. He grimly even said in one post, "I hope your children will also be in the infantry to carry out your orders." And this was, he told the Wall Street Journal he felt forced to speak out after his battalion was repeatedly ordered by senior commanders to launch assaults that were unrealistic given his unit's capabilities. The final straw, he said, was an order for his men to go back into Kursk, the Russian region where Ukrainian forces had captured a year ago and then were forced out of. The direction of the ordered attack was predictable, and the Russians were completely prepared for it. Wave after wave of Russian infantry counterattacks forced retreat, and many men were killed. He said, "These were young and motivated. I had high hopes for them. Instead, we just lost them." He said, "We need to change our methods from quantity to quality. We can't beat Russia with our resources. They're bigger, and we need to be better." The result, of course, is that the army's leadership disciplined him for indiscipline, and General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, brushed him off as an attention seeker. Now, this is something that even many generals within the Ukrainian military are acknowledging, and that they compare a Soviet-style command system in which essentially the lessons of World War II that the Soviets took was that human lives are expendable. Holding territory, achieving strategic objectives, even achieving tactical objectives is worth lives. In contrast, you have a Western style in which the Western way of war was developed during the Cold War, when there was an assumption that the Soviets and the Soviet armed forces would simply outnumber NATO forces. And so NATO forces needed a doctrine that allowed them to continually preserve their most difficult to acquire resource, manpower. That meant that there was, an acceptance that individual commanders would have to fight in a dynamic way. That meant that they would be making more decisions about what happens for their units, but also it meant that units would be expected to engage in a more maneuver type of warfare, in which there would be more withdrawing, more sort of attacking, that static positions, attritional warfare would be something to be largely avoided. Now, obviously, these doctrinal philosophies were both written before the era of the drone. Right. But in one example, they talk about another commander who wanted to withdraw his battalion of Ukraine's presidential brigade from a badly exposed position in southern Donetsk. He intercepted Russian plans to surround the battalion, but his staff headquarters kept telling him to stay put, even as larger and larger Russian forces were outflanking his unit. So eventually he made his own decision to withdraw. Over 3 days, he conducted a fighting withdrawal. Most of the battalion escaped from the trap, but a platoon that stayed behind to cover the retreat was nearly wiped out. As a result, he was investigated by military police and the SBU for abandoning of positions, and eventually the investigations petered out. And he later got promoted to deputy brigade commander because somebody high up probably saw that I was acting reasonably. And this is a they really point the finger, this article, at Alexander Sirski, who they refer to as the Butcher. And you can see here that literally that's 2 of his 3 nicknames. General 200 means General KIA, effectively. Well, that is literally what it translates to, General KIA, or the Butcher. And this is because in the Battle of Bakhmut, he famously held the Battle of Bakhmut tenaciously, but at tremendous cost. And a lot of people argue one of the reasons Ukraine's counteroffensive failed is because the elite combat-hardened units that were holding Bakhmut while other units were preparing, those elite combat-hardened units would have been really needed in the fighting in the south. And instead, those units were ground down, holding Bakhmut, a village that ultimately the Russians ended up taking anyway. And so this willingness to make the Russians pay dearly for every inch of territory, it feels good. It sounds great as a propaganda move, but the problem is you can't propaganda your way to more soldiers. And the Ukrainians may have to, in Western doctrine, there would never have been a Battle of Bakhmut. It would have been a de facto acceptance that the Russians are going to take Bakhmut and that the goal is to turn it into a kill box. And this is, again, the strategy that, that is the strategy that we've seen better Ukrainian units inflict. And that was the strategy, for example, of the first commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, who was so popular that he actually ended up becoming a sort of threat to Zelensky. He also notably acknowledged that the war was a stalemate, which was almost certainly correct at the time he said it, but that was seen as an uncomfortably transparent statement. And so he ended up getting fired and reassigned, and Sirski took his place. This is, again, a pretty significant problem because, well, Zaluzhny would have continued to serve likely in that position. And the fact is that the Ukrainian armed forces probably would have fought less sort of pitched battles. And we can think about them, right? Not only is the Battle of Bakhmut one example of these high attrition, low return battles, but you also have, for example, the efforts of the Ukrainian Marines who conducted this sort of amphibious attrition operation across the Neper River in Kherson. You can see down here in Kherson, right, some of these sort of swampy areas were places, right, Kozachi, Lahari, where Ukrainians conducted operations. But then often what would happen is, despite being tactically unbelievably disadvantageous to the Ukrainians, they would continue to try to hold some of these areas, right? So Kozachi, Lahari, notably, you had these Ukrainian Marines who initially sort of tried to conduct this amphibious assault, secured a small bridgehead in a few villages, but very quickly the Russians deployed forces and contained these breaches because simply in a war of attrition, the person who can do better logistics wins. And it's almost impossible to do logistics across a river when you don't have a bridge. So the Ukrainians lost, by some reports, up to 800 KIA. These are good Marines in this operation that persisted for months and months and months, long after it had any value. The thinking was that by continually feeding Ukrainian Marines into this meat grinder, it would pin Russian forces in place. But at the end of the day, the Ukrainians' losses outweighed the Russian losses because the Russians simply were fighting from a better position. And so I think there is a lot of validity to the criticism. I think what's also notable, though, what I think is important is that, well, one of the things that has been lost is actually Western trainers. And this is, according to Business Insider, talks about the fact that even though the Western trainers haven't fought necessarily the Ukraine-style war, they point out that at least junior instructors for young soldiers, they actually bring a lot of value. And part of it is because, well, the fundamentals are the fundamentals. We've seen this, for example, in a lot of global war on terror era veterans that volunteer for Ukrainian units. They end up being excellent performing soldiers. There's a reason why many units like the Azov Brigade have opened their own international battalions because, well, frankly, Western trained soldiers do perform great on the battlefield. And it's not because they've seen this war or they've seen these kinds of drones. It's because they have the fundamental principles down pat, right? These are things like communication and coordination, coming up with an operational plan and executing that plan. Basic things like operating your weapon, cover, fire and maneuver, communication. And even if the Ukrainians simply repeat the same battle drills that they do when clearing a trench, these Western trainers, it's like knowing how to train. It's a little bit like if you were to go to an MMA gym and say, listen, I have a boxing fight coming up. They'd say, listen, none of us have ever fought a boxing fight, but we know how to train for fights. So we can give you the basics of boxing, and we can be like, given that you've already done some, here's how to turn it into a game plan. Here's how to write a game plan. Here's how to practice that game plan. Here's some guys that'll help you work through your game plan. And so by the time you step into the ring, even though you're the only person who's ever boxed, you end up with a really good preparation, right? I guess if you've never fought any combat sports, you have no idea what I'm talking about. This is 100% what happens very frequently. And it's quite effective, right? And that's similar to the US, where they say, listen, we don't know per se how to fight your war, but we can show you how to look at intelligence, how to look at maps, conduct plans, and how you guys can become better at fighting the war yourselves, and how to drill, right? That's the other thing, is training how to train, to say, listen, here's how you drill. Okay, you have to clear this trench. Great. How are you going to conduct reconnaissance? How are you going to come up with a plan? How are you going to rehearse the plan? How are you going to execute it? These are all things that are really valuable. But here's what people forget, is that we know intuitively that this works for Ukrainian enlisted soldiers at the tactical level, but it also happens at the strategic level. And my thesis is that one of the reasons you're seeing a regression among Ukraine's senior leadership to Soviet-style tactics is they've lost the direct mentorship that they were receiving from the United States. As the New York Times talked about, as a bunch of other reporting has talked about, American generals were side by side with the Ukrainians, feeding them information, providing them key targets or key areas of interest that they could choose to target. All of these decisions, right? Helping them to review and assess their plans, probably scrubbing it against intelligence analysis. Again, imagine if you were a Ukrainian general and you had the CIA on speed dial. You'd sit there and go, hey, I'm thinking about having my guys attack this village. What can you tell me about it? The CIA would likely come back a few hours later and say, we can't tell you why, but you should not be attacking that village. Instead, you should be looking about 10 kilometers to the south. Don't ask how we know it. Just trust us. And you'd be like, okay, well, the CIA's tapping some phones. They're looking at satellites that they can't tell us about. They've got maybe an insider in the Kremlin staff. Any of this information is all going to be valuable, but it's also in part like reassuring. And that's also what trainers sometimes do. Again, if you've ever been in a boxing fight, you know that literally 50% of what your trainer does sometimes is tell you, yo, you're ready. You're confident. This is the right game plan. You've done everything right. Your plan to go to the body is going to work, right? Your body shots are great. Your timing's on point. You just need to be reminded, don't vary the course. You're doing good. And that's something where if you don't have the US, you're not going to know it, right? To sit there and say, hey, listen, or to tell when you're making a mistake. Because again, if the US can get insight into the Russian military that isn't otherwise there, well, then the Ukrainians are going to be stuck saying, well, maybe we're out killing the Russians by a lot. Maybe these casualties are worth it. And it depends on, again, the high level analysis that can be done by the most well-funded intelligence agency in the globe to sit there and go, no, you guys were better off when you are pulling your forces back, force the Russians to come out of their positions again and grind them down. And the truth is, that's based on sort of the data, based on the map. That's what I assumed had been happening, that the Ukrainians were withdrawing from positions and ended up getting them annihilated, which is pretty problematic because, again, as you can see, the Russian forces are continually making these advances, but the advances are coming at tremendous cost, right? Again, look at my favorite example, the Battle of Toretsk. Let's look literally a year ago here we go. Here's Toretsk in August 15th. You can see Russian forces at the outskirts of the city, and you can see after 1 year of grueling fighting, the Russians have made it a few kilometers through the city. And so this is, again, this 6 kilometers in the course of a year, maybe 7 if you're being generous. And I think, this idea of a fighting retreat is probably one that should have been the case But I guess it's a case to me, my criticism, if this is true, is that, well, if you're going to have to withdraw from territory, you might as well, if you could have reduced your casualties 60% by allowing the Russians to advance 50% faster, well, it wouldn't have made a difference, right? Like it wouldn't have made, the Russians would be like, at Petropavlivka instead of still fighting over Pokrovsk, right? Yeah, the Russian advance is slowed to a crawl, but at tremendous Ukrainian cost. And is it worth it, right? Like that's the ultimate question. And I think it may be from the highest levels of the Ukrainian government. And this might be why, right? It's easy to blame incompetence, but generals, like most people aren't incompetent. They're just subject to a set of constraints that you don't understand. And what's probably happened is Zelensky has said, listen, realistically, we are not going to take back any territory from the Russians. So every kilometer the Russians advance is going to be a kilometer that's probably going to be theirs permanently. So we have to fight tooth and nail for every kilometer. But we see how this creates massive problems, because what you have to do to fight tooth and nail for every kilometer, it means you have to rob from something more valuable. It's a little bit like pulling from your retirement fund in order to pay for your kids' baseball lessons or something. You go, yeah, like it's good. You promise, hey, I'm going to make sure little Johnny gets to play baseball, and that's good. But at some point, your retirement funds are going to drop to zero. And the fear is that you'll turn around and go, damn, now Johnny can't play baseball and I can't retire. So you're going to lose something of critical importance, in this case, Ukrainian manpower, in order to achieve a foregone conclusion, which is, in this case, Russian advances. And so, again, I think it's something where the Ukrainians may need, seem to be recognizing this, right? Zelensky has explicitly said, listen, let's just get the Russians squeezed enough that they feel a ceasefire is necessary, and is willing to agree to a ceasefire, and then we'll freeze the front line and we'll negotiate peace from there. And that's been his stance for months now. And so I think this idea of like, oh, we're going to, we're going to take anything back, or we have to fight for every inch of territory, is probably starting to be realized by commanders that this is just not going to work. The other problem is that a lot of mobilized Ukrainians, mobilization has become very unpopular, in part because in order to fill these high casualty infantry units, they're starting to look more and more Russian, with limited training, limited experience, missions that are incredibly dangerous with an incredibly high casualty rate. And this it is a surefire way to reduce mobilization, because why would you sign up for a military where you simply fight until you until you're KIA, right? No one wants to sign up for that. Not without sufficient compensation. See the Russian military. And I think that is one of the other troubling aspects of this, is like the Russian military is not going to, like, they can afford to pay these exorbitant salaries. The Ukrainians don't have the funds to do it. And so, and the median Ukrainian infantryman, like, he just needs to live longer. Okay. He needs to live not as long as possible, but he needs to live a lot longer. And that may mean creating, again, as we talked about, a massive gray zone, right? Where Ukrainians say, listen, the Russians are going to have to plow through a sea of fiber optic drones before they get to the nearest Ukrainian position. And what would that mean? That could mean 30 kilometers where the Ukrainians say, listen, we are just going to pound these Russians into dirt before they find their first Ukrainian infantryman, even if that means abandoning a big swath of territory. It was discussed as the drone wall strategy, and it's not a bad one. But again, it requires a recognition that you're going to have to yield some territory to the Russians voluntarily, right? Before you could fight the Russians every which way. There's also a little bit of a problem of initiative, where the initiative is a lot harder than people appreciate. Because remember, we just talked about the fact that you say, oh, units want to withdraw, in that article we just saw. Well, one commander said, I took initiative and withdrew my units from a position that they weren't allowed to leave. But then we saw another interview in the same article where a commander said, hey, I was holding a position and I turned around and realized the unit to my flank had withdrawn and not told anyone. And so when you have this kind of linear war, well, you have to coordinate. And the problem is you end up having to coordinate almost like a whole across the whole front line, because it's like dominoes. Imagine if one unit was to pull their slot out and withdraw. Well, then another unit has to pull their slot out and withdraw, and another unit, and another unit, and another unit. And it's very difficult, but not impossible. And again, that's the other appeal, I think, of the drone wall strategy, is it grants you flexibility to sort of, your line becomes more stretchy. And so, again, is this a sign that Ukraine probably needs a lot more Western support? Yeah, probably. Is it a sign that the Russians are winning? No, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that there needs to be probably an increased recognition by the Ukrainians to say, listen, we have to accept that the Russians are going to continue to advance in the East, but we need to create a protocol, a paradigm that allows us to fight sustainably, potentially for years to come. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button. I really appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.